How's it going, gamers? I'm Pruitt. This is Jim Davis, and you better roll for perception. Otherwise, this episode of WebDM might come out and get you, because it's about traps.
It's traps. It's a trap show.
Yeah, it's a trap show. Let's do an episode on traps. What do you think about that?
I don't want to give the impression to our viewers that I hate everything, but
That's an interesting preface, though.
but I do like this game, and I actually really do. I don't like traps because I find, in my experience from both a player and a DM, as both a consumer of adventures and a player of D&D, that for the most part, traps are boring and basically just attacks on your hit points. And so
Wait. Like, a tax on your hit points or attacks?
A tax.
Yeah. Okay.
A penalty.
Yeah.
You must, pay 3 hit points to proceed. And I think there's a specific reason for this. I think the reason why traps traditionally kind of suck and they're not as interesting is because Dungeons & Dragons, when you're playing it, you're having to visualize a lot of things, and you're having to rely on DM description.
Yeah.
And there's no way for a DM to give clues that there's a part of the environment you can interact with that is the trap, without giving away that there is a trap there.
That there is something in the environment that you should look at.
Right. Some DMs handle it by sort of being real question and answer with what the players are doing, how they're interacting with the environment. And some DMs don't like that. They feel like the whole game breaks down into 20 questions. They don't want to have to answer so many questions from the players. My personal opinion on DMs like that is I play your game, you do you. What are you doing if you're not answering players' questions about the game world? That's my opinion.
Well, yeah.
Because we're not all mechanical engineers with degrees in trap making or experience with making traps. Traps tend to fall into these weird categories where it's just like, all right, roll the dice to get your perception. Did you spot it? Yes. All right, here's your disable device check or your thieves tools check to get rid of it. You failed. Okay. Here's how much damage you take, make a save. It's uninteresting and becomes something, number one, that only one player in the party has anything to do with. Everyone else kind of sits aside while the rogue or whoever goes and deals with the traps. Mm-hmm. And then there's not much interaction going on. It's just the rogue or whoever making the rolls.
Right.
And then if they fail, they pay some hit points. And if that's the only way you've ever seen traps presented, then the traps are just going to be boring. And so I've largely cut traps out of my dungeons. Yeah. And I've largely gotten rid of them. I don't care for spear traps or poison dart traps. I don't care for scything blades. But the only basic mechanical trap I like is the pit trap.
Yeah.
Because you can do weird things with, there's other creature at the bottom of the pit, or there's a secret door at the bottom of the pit that you actually need to go through.
Yeah. Sometimes in order to take 2 steps forward, you need to take 1 step back.
Right.
We got to fall in that pit trap.
You got to fall in that pit trap.
My leg, guys. And there's a door.
There's a door right here.
A
pit trap could lead to a chute that takes you down to another level of the dungeon that
otherwise you don't know how to get down to.
You otherwise wouldn't know how to get to, and now you don't know how to get back up. So there's pit traps are interesting in that regard because they're things that you can interact with a bit more than just like, oh, I opened this chest and a dart shot out at me. Where did that dart come from? What mechanism? Can I smash this chest up and break the trap beforehand without destroying the contents of the chest? So I find like number one, traps, mechanical traps like that I tend to find a little boring, so I've largely not used them. And then magical traps like glyphs of warding and sort of zones of weird magic can sometimes be really fun. But if overused, can create a situation where it's like, there are 12 symbols of death guarding this door. Like, well, I don't know what, you can overuse them in a way.
Yeah, and then if it's not all in one spot, if it becomes like a whole dungeon that's full of them,
right,
then your wizard is taking 10 minutes like every half hour to cast Detect Magic.
To cast Detect Magic,
it's a ritual, so he doesn't waste his slots.
Yeah, and then how many Dispel Magics does he have to get rid of these things?
Yeah.
Or you can certainly overdo it with magical traps. But again, I don't want to give the impression that there's this whole element of dungeoneering, the trap. Yeah. That is iconic and interesting. When I think of traps, I want them to be like the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah. Going in a place and it's dangerous, or maybe there was some kind of mechanism set up to deter you from a particular area.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to figure this thing out, and even when he thinks he figured it out, he didn't figure it out.
He didn't quite figure it out,
and he
yeah.
still triggered the trap.
So I look to try to create a puzzle if I want to feature a trap. And so to me, a puzzle is different than just a regular trap because the entire team can get in on it. It requires, say, more than just the rogue going off by themselves and disarming the traps. It requires the wizard doing something, the fighter doing something, the cleric doing something. Everybody in the party has a role to play in getting past this puzzle.
Yeah, the fighter needs to rotate that statue like
something
20 degrees, but it's really heavy, so you need the cleric to cast enhance ability on them.
Some of my favorite traps that I've seen are Grimtooth's traps, which are Grimtooth is this. They're these books for Dungeons and Dragons. They've been out for a while. Each edition they kind of get updated or brought back, but you can buy any of the Grimtooth books, and they're just like lavishly detailed with diagrams and illustrations and full explanations of sort of how the trap works, what does it do. And so it's something that the players can interact with. And it's not just did you pass your perception check? No, well, you're sprayed with poison gas from this container that's somewhere, but how did it live there for millennia? I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the Grimtooth traps have an attempt to make them a part of an environment that you can interact with and experiment with and explore. And that requires the DM to be very precise in their descriptions.
Yeah.
To be very forgiving of the player's descriptions of what they're doing, because an interactive trap is prime territory for the DM to go, well, you didn't say exactly, and then the player to go, but my character would have. And when you get in those kind of arguments, the game's broken down. So I would encourage DMs to be like, make sure that they're asking clarifying questions. You said your character was doing this. Can you describe to me what that looks like?
Yeah, specifically the steps he does to do that thing.
Do that thing, whatever it is. I'm running my dagger along a seam in the stone to see if I catch a mechanism that will release the trap or release the secret door. Because secret doors are a cousin to traps, as it were.
Yeah,
they involve a lot of the same skills and.
Yeah, you're finding something that's hidden. It just doesn't damage you.
Right.
But still, walking along and sprinkling sand, next to what you think a crack is to look for an airflow.
To look where the airflow is, or to see if it sinks into the ground anywhere to recognize where a trap is.
Yeah, trap door.
Preparing for this episode, I went and reread the trap section in the DMG, and the traps in the DMG are actually very well thought out.
Yeah.
They're not as exhaustive as Grimtooth's traps are. But they do give some thought to how this works and what you need to do to overcome it. And the advice in that chapter in the DMG says, don't let die rolls overcome common sense and clever role playing.
Right.
And so to me that brings us to a point about traps that it really highlights the style of play from older editions of D&D to newer editions of D&D. And that's the idea that there's a difference between player ability and character ability.
Right.
Your skill as a player matters, and it has nothing to do with what's on your character sheet.
Yeah.
And so having a trap that requires you to think and interact with and explore the environment through question and answer, as opposed to rolling a die and having that be that.
Yeah.
Some groups like testing player ability and player skill, and other groups are like, well, why? I'm playing a role-playing game. This is my character. I want that to be the medium through which I interact with the game environment. It's just a choice. It's just a personal preference. But if you've never played in that style, then maybe you give it a shot.
Yeah.
And you try out a game where most skills you won't use. You don't roll those dice. You just do it through interacting and through description.
We do it sometimes whenever we're dealing with traps, trap doors, stuff like that. I mean, all the time we're like we just described on how to look for trap doors. And when I'm DMing, even if I have you roll, you just got a hefty bonus.
Right,
and you're probably going to find it. I mean,
Yep.
if you actually describe, I might give you advantage or a bonus in my own head that I add on to whatever you tell me.
Yeah.
But those are ways for the DM to kind of get around that. Speak for a minute about passive perception, because that is to me a key element in the dungeon.
Yeah.
So you don't tip players off.
So passive perception in this edition is a way that you can kind of tailor your descriptions of the environment to give clues to the players who have the passive necessary passive perception without, say, giving away too much. And so it might be, first off, you need to know what your players' passive scores are. Whether it's passive perception, might even be passive investigation, depending on what feats they've taken.
Right.
And have those written out so that you have them handy, and then you just tailor your descriptions. Okay, for your character and your character, you also notice this other feature of the environment, or you're a dwarven engineer. You notice that the slope of this particular corridor suggests, or you detect a hidden passageway over here.
Right.
What you do with that information, what that information means, or how you how you react to it, entirely up to the player.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes in your descriptions you include things that are interesting, but not necessarily deadly, so that you don't train your players to go, okay, every time the DM really describes something, it's a trap or a hazard or a threat. You instead start incorporating descriptions and detail about things that are just there to be interacted with. And maybe they have no purpose other than for the player to go, well, what's up with this? Like, why does this moose head on the wall move? What does that do? What's that noise for? Well, they might not ever figure it out, but it's there to sort of
build tension,
to raise questions amongst the players, to keep them on their toes.
Exactly.
And then the next time they're presented with something they can interact with, they're like, okay, well, it could be dangerous, it could not. We don't know. It's going to require some tinkering and fiddling around with. That's sort of how, in very broad terms, how I would approach traps.
Yeah, like how to get the players to interact better. What are some ways, and some ways to just improve upon the standard trap, or to change up a dungeon and make it more interesting to players?
So you're talking about making like a puzzle dungeon.
Well, yeah, I
or
mean,
a trap-filled dungeon.
Yeah, just if most traps are,
I think that maybe each level of the dungeon would have 2 to 3 big puzzle traps that are the feature of that dungeon. So I'm thinking of things like corridors that have a counterweight, that as you're walking down them, they move down, closing off retreat behind you and forcing you down into deeper levels of the dungeon. And so that counterweight is, by the time you've triggered it, it's too late for you to do anything about it, unless, say, you're all flying or something like that.
Right.
Which flying is one of those things that once you can reliably do it, it cuts out so many different kinds of traps you can use.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's a room that rotates, and depending on what rotation it's in, a different set of doors is opened up. But maybe surviving the rotation is an issue. It's a violent twisting kind of thing. Maybe it flips the room, and so all the characters go tumbling as they get knocked around this thing. It really raises the question of if I was designing a dungeon that featured several of these puzzle rooms prominently, are these designed to just hinder the party? And present options and obstacles that they have to overcome, or are they designed to injure the party, drain their resources, make them so that when they eventually get to the threat that they're getting to, or to their goal, they're going to have been depleted? Or are these designed to stop the party?
Right. This
would be the trap, like you're in a room, all the doors seal shut, and sand starts to pour in. That's the kind of one where that is a clear signal that you are not meant to survive that, and we hope that you have a means of getting out of that situation.
Yeah, like a genie.
Like a genie, yes. Like a genie. That's very handy to have in your back pocket. Knowing what kind of puzzles what kind of traps that you want to use, whether you want to make it a puzzle to interact with, a deadly trap that needs to be avoided at all cost.
Right.
And of course, the granddaddy of all puzzle and trap-filled dungeons of them is the Tomb of Horrors.
Yeah.
And it is one of those dungeons. It's going to be included in the Tales of the Yawning Portal that's coming out in March. I'm curious to see whether or not they will keep the elements that made it so deadly and such a challenge to overcome in 5th edition, because the design philosophy of 1st edition to 5th edition is so different. What you expect out of characters.
Just a little bit.
Just what you expect out of characters, how often you're going to make a new character, what you're going to do with them, has changed so much in those years. in these decades since when Tomb of Horrors was originally released. And the purpose of Tomb of Horrors was always to humble overmighty players.
Yeah.
The Return of Tomb of Horrors module that was released for 2nd edition has a lengthy discussion by Gygax about why he created this dungeon and the things that he would do, taking people's character sheets when they died in it. You know, it was designed for tournament play, for players who thought they were hot stuff and yet wouldn't think their way through problems. And yet when you read the Tomb of Horrors and you go, you know, if you had a player that asked a ton of questions about their environment and slowed down and considered what was going on. Okay, what does the ceiling look like? What's going on with the tiles on the floor? Can I tap them? Does it sound like some places hollow and some places not? What happens if I do this? I'm not going to stick my hand in any yawning portals of blackness.
Oh, God.
Like, I listened to the riddle that they read to me at the beginning of the module. When Gygax says that the Tomb of Horrors is a thinking player's dungeon, that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
You don't charge headlong into it.
No.
But at the same time, there are some nasty traps in Tomb of Horrors.
There's some shit that in there that's just like, that's just cruel.
If you're going to be a player in a campaign that's using the Tales of the Yawning Portal, maybe you want to take a break here while we talk a bit more about Tomb of Horrors.
Spoiler alert.
But I'm going to talk about just sort of what I remember about the beginning of the dungeon. There's 3 entrances. They're all of them hidden. Two of those entrances are false. One of those is the actual entrance to the dungeon. Those 2 false entrances do things like collapse the entire ceiling of the corridor on you. You are buried under 60 feet of rock and rubble, and then you got to get out. Another one is like you open a door and are teleported to the beginning of the dungeon. All of your stuff is deeper in the dungeon. All of it. You are naked and alone at the beginning of the dungeon.
Just like in life.
Taking your stuff. And that means, are you a wizard? You don't have your spell book. You don't have your material components. You better hope you have some verbal and somatic only spells that you can cast. And in 1st edition, you didn't have your spell book, so you can't like relearn those spells once they've been cast. At the very least, in 5th edition, you still have those spells memorized kind of at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Kind of what I'm curious, are they going to contain those elements? Is there going to be a sphere of annihilation in that green devil's mouth that you can lose an arm to, or a hand, or an entire person?
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that, and of course, the demi-lich at the end, if you're not prepared to fight a demi-lich, then you're just SOL. But there are other things like the juggernaut that crushes you, the corridor that lowers into lava, the teetering room that spills you over into. I mean, it's just like there's so many things about the dungeon that are challenges. They challenge the player's resources and they challenge their ability to think through it.
Now we went through, was it the Return or we do Tomb of Horrors?
I ran you guys through Return to the Tomb of Horrors, which features the Tomb of Horrors quite prominently. It was an adventure path for the 25th anniversary of D&D, and it sort of this heavily meta-plotted kind of game where the Lich is trying to merge with the negative energy plane so that they can control all undead everywhere, and you've got to like track them down and find them. But I also ran it for you guys using the epic level rules in 3rd edition. And so you guys didn't go through there as like, 6th or 7th or even 12th level characters. You guys were like 27th level in 3rd edition, decked out in magic items. I believe the party consisted of like 5 or 6 it was you guys were able to navigate the dungeon mostly by the fact that you were flying through it.
Yeah.
And really it was only a handful of locations where you had to like sit and look at it. And so it does go to show you that you can't brute force your way through these kind of things.
Yeah.
Famously, one of the people who conquered it in Gygax's day just had 100 orcs that they just like, just send them all in.
It's like the Nazis at the end of Last Crusade.
Right, just
sending guys
send them in. And so I think that I'm excited to see what Tomb of Horrors has in store for us for 5th edition. Of course, they updated it in 3rd edition, and it was still plenty deadly. But if you're looking for the type of puzzle traps that I'm thinking of, Tomb of Horrors is what I have in mind, just less of them.
Right.
As opposed to the, every room is a puzzle that you have to overcome. Maybe you just have 1 or 2 of those per level that you build your dungeon around.
Exactly.
I guess the people who left for the spoilers can come back now.
Yeah, you can come on back. Other than mechanical traps,
Yeah.
what's some other ways that a DM can spruce up his dungeon?
So it's just making it an interesting environment to play in. I mean, I think that this is one of those things where the dungeon is a dynamic environment.
Yeah.
And traps are one way that you can highlight that, whether or not they've been set off or you use them against other creatures. You found that trap, you were going to lure someone else into it. But the dungeon environment it works best when it's a location the players can learn.
Yeah.
That they can explore on multiple occasions, finding secret doors that they missed the first time around, different routes to different locations. If you stretch your dungeon out into a flat line and it looks like A, B, C, D, E, even though you might have corridors snaking everywhere in different rooms, if you stretch it out and it's a linear path, then chances are that dungeon is less interesting than if you stretch it out and it branches.
Right.
There should be multiple ways to get to different locations, and you can have certain rooms in your dungeons that are kind of central hubs. Like this is where an interesting statue is, a statue that talks or answers a question once a day, or a fountain that heals you, depending on some criteria that's met, or anything like that. An interesting feature of the dungeon that you can kind of create as to a hub, and then there's multiple ways to get to it, and then a lot of empty space in that dungeon. It doesn't need to be that every room is filled with a bunch of stuff. Wandering monster tables are perfect for this because they simulate the fact that the dungeon isn't a static environment.
Yeah.
There are monsters coming and going from their lairs. They are, the goblins down on level 3 have established an outpost on level 1, which they use to raid the surface and act as an early warning system for their, for their main lair on level 3, which is connected by a vertical shaft that they've built a wooden latticework thing into. A dungeon that has had multiple occupants, who maybe originally was built by dwarves, but then drow moved in at some point and altered some parts of that, and then a tribe of troglodytes came in and altered another part of it. Telling a story through the environment of the dungeon is what makes dungeons interesting.
Yeah, like the Black Rock game.
Yeah.
Or was it? Yeah, Black
Well,
Rock? No, White Rock. Sorry.
Castle White Rock.
I don't always say that.
We had two. I ran two campaigns. Well, I ran a Black Rock campaign and a White Rock campaign.
That's what's confusing.
This would be why. And they were both dungeon crawls.
White Rock though.
White Rock is Dungeon Crawl Classics, Castle White Rock box set. And it features just a mountain that the players go exploring in, and the upper levels are sort of mines, and then you get into where some sort of troglodytes and lizard folk live. And the further down into the mountain you get, the more you get to like a weird, like someone teleported a pyramid inside this mountain, and that's what they use as their tomb. And then there were drow that were in these massive hollowed out stalactites guarding a certain fungal forest. And eventually there was a dark dwarf city that had a lot going on for it. And eventually,
like a fighting ring, right?
There was like a fighting ring and a necropolis there, and then eventually you get down to the bottom, which is like this lake of lava that the ghost dragon lives in. But each level has a theme. Each level has a different primary inhabitant. Each level had a different way to interact with them. Sometimes you fought them, sometimes you traded with them. You could take over a level afterwards. So you clear out the mines and local dwarves move in. The first 2 levels are now friendly to you. I mean, they're filled with friendly creatures.
Right.
Dwarves and gnomes going about their mining business. I did it with the Castle Black Rock game, which was my own design of dungeon, in which the upper levels of the dungeon were guarded by a garrison that changed hands many times. Initially built by dwarves, it had been taken over by orcs and ogres and dragons and elemental cultists, and there was just a competing factions within the dungeon are what make it a dynamic environment.
Yeah.
And so you can do that with, you can have dynamism and make your dungeon environments more interesting by having traps you can kind of interact with, but also by creating a dungeon that exists and has a life of its own using random monster tables, factions in the dungeon, different themed rooms and levels.
Nice.
There you go.
Woo!
Oh man. 6 more to go.
Hey man, it's only 11 o'clock.
We're gonna be fine.
We can knock out 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Before noon?
Before noon. Very good. Mimics. Mimics are...
Well, let's first start with just the word mimic.
Let's start with the word mimic. Let's start with what this means.
It's one of those words that I just love.
Mimic.
Like, yeah.
You just like saying it?
Yeah.
Mimic. You just like...
It's almost like it's mocking
Here on
itself.
WebDM, it's like here on WebDM, Pruitt and Jim ramble on for hours on end about no topic in particular, and we expect you to watch this shit. I like to do a WebDM episode where it's like a random table. Like we have the chart behind us and someone rolls the big D20.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, riff on this one that you didn't prepare for.
Hey, Trev, I'm just wondering, is there is there a pillow anywhere, like a lumbar pillow I could put behind my back? Because I keep leaning back and I'm trying not to, but I want to. Ooh, over there on the couch.
Yeah, there's some
Why don't you? Okay.
That might be a little big.
Well, no, that's okay because if I just, it will take up the space that I need, so I don't have to move. Because this thing, I got all this.
There's so much. I mean, it makes you want to sit back, and then you're like, but I want to sit up straight.
It's WebDM. It's a laid-back episode of WebDM. It's all about chilling and killing, man.
Mommy told me that girls who sit up straight get good husbands, so that's why I want to have good posture.
And girls who lay back get pregnant. Wait, what? It's a little severe.
It is.
Now, can you see that?
Chop all the women's meat.
Oh, my God, that's just. See, now I'm locked in. I don't have to. There's no effort being made on my part to sit up right now. This is beautiful. He's backing and smacking. He's hacking and whacking and smacking. He's hacking.
I thought that I spent
chopping
years,
that meat.
I thought it chop the feet.
Yeah.
Is what I thought it was, and so I was like, oh, it's a song about dancing.
He's just
like this
dancing with
guy
all the
just
ladies.
comes in and dances with all the ladies. Like that's probably an issue in the 40s. Like,
Yeah.
you stole my dance partner.
Exactly, but no.
No.
You were right in a way, but no. It's chopping that woman's meat.
Yes.
Look it up, kids, from Fallout 3. Roy Brown, Butcher Pete, Part 1. It's about sex.
It's about
It's about a lot of sex.
Yes.
What were we talking about? Mimics?